about half an hour or so for questions, and so what I'll do is just maybe point to you, and you can maybe stand and try to address whoever you'd like. And I'll stand here and listen, and
well, I got here a little late, so maybe it's addressed, but I was interested that among, I mean, you mentioned a lot of countries and a lot of points with regard to the, what do you want to call it, dichotomy, Catholic, Catholicism, etc. But one country that was not mentioned was Spain, at least while I was here. Nor was there any mention, as far as I'm aware, of the Spanish Inquisition, which is one of the most fundamental parts of the history. And I don't know if he dealt with that, and if he didn't, I'd be curious as to why. And should I use that? Oh, do I have to repeat it? Anyway, my question essentially was that at least while I was here, there was no mention of Spain or the Spanish Inquisition, and I don't know to whom I should direct the question because I got here a little bit late. But I'm curious if Giussani addressed that, and if so, how.
I'm going to just jump in and say I'm sure that he didn't in the book, only because the time period and the place were so different. In other words, Protestantism in America, the time period that he was dealing with was much.
Oh, he only dealt with America. I didn't know that.
Much later than the Spanish Inquisition.
But any thoughts you have on it, I'd be interested anyway.
Thank you. Any other questions? Otherwise,
one always hears of Don Giuss in relation to Reinhold Niebuhr. Now, what happened to Richard? Whenever I read Richard Niebuhr's meaning of Revelation, I feel a very Giussanian spirit that I don't find in his brother. Could you comment on that?
I would love to comment on that. Or Christ and culture.
Yes.
Christ and culture is monumental. Christ and culture hadn't been written yet. Or, no, it had been written. But I don't think it caught his, because of the vein, he was writing a historical theology. That's what Giussani is writing here. He wasn't therefore writing a cultural interpretation of the movements of the Christian faith within the American culture, and how, or for that matter within Western culture, and how that integration of Christianity affected the cultural goods. It's really kind of too bad. I do think you're right but you can't write everything, right? You can't say everything. But boy, it would have been interesting to see what impact Christ and culture would have had on Giussani, because precisely Giussani could have written a book like Christ and culture. So that's a lacuna that, I have no explanation for, except to say that his dissertation was taking him directly into Reinhold Niebuhr, and therefore the work really is expressive of that kind of background. But your point is very well taken.
In the dissertation, does he deal with the public disagreements between the two brothers in the 1930s over American foreign policy?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge. I didn't see it in. I took a look at the work in Italian. I would not have been able to discern. Of course, I don't read Italian, but I would not have been able to discern. I think would have been able to discern had any conversation come up. No. But Americans would do well to revisit the conversations between Reinhold and Richard Niebuhr. They would do very well. As a matter of fact, some of the issues they're facing today were very important issues. Man and Society by Reinhold Niebuhr, Meaning of Revelation by Richard Niebuhr, and the conversation that they were both having at that time, I think represented very well the Protestant spirit at its apogee, at its height and ready to decline. There was a possibility there that a social commonwealth could have been found in the kind of work that Niebuhr, Richard, and Reinhold were talking about at the time. Because even though they disagreed, they were not far off the page from one another. That's for sure. Thank you. Great question. I like that.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question related to my experience and also some of the things that you commented on, both in communal liberation and then also in American Protestantism. Not that long ago, I was talking to a friend of mine. I'm part of communal liberation and have some familiarity, though not yours, with American Protestantism and many Protestant friends. And I'm saying to an Italian friend of mine that I find the emphasis on Jesus and on Christ in communal liberation something that is more familiar to me in many ways, in my experience with my Protestant friends, than with many of my Catholic friends. I don't find that my Catholic friends tend to talk as readily about Jesus as Protestants. And I was just wondering about that in relation to Giussani's relationship to Protestantism and his interest. This is a question for both of you. And I mean, I'm open to being correct that she was saying that in certain veins of her Italian experience, that was not so unusual to talk about Jesus that way. But I have not encountered that in my experience so much.
I'll just give a real short response and then over to you, because this summer when I was in Rimini, I said that there is a certain level of discomfort arising in American Protestantism. It's already there in the liberal and neoliberal, and I would say to some degree, the Orthodox versions of it, but also now in mainstream evangelicalism. There's a good degree of discomfort that comes with the particularity of the name Jesus Christ. So it may well be that a guy like Giussani needs to rescue our Protestant faith vis-a-vis Christ, because Giussani has no problem whatsoever. And as a matter of fact, it's one of the things that I find endearing about his theology.
Two things come to my mind. One is in America, it's very possible that Catholics sort of define themselves against the Protestant milieu, and so we always spoke in the language of those mediating structures that mediate Jesus, of the church, the sacraments, and so on. I mean, that's one thing. But I find, as a convert, that there really is a kind of tendency in Catholicism towards a kind of Pelagianism, where Christianity is sort of being a good person, and that goes with the reduction of Christ to a kind of a good example, social reformer. The thing is, I read this book. Now that I read this book, like I said, I'm not a historian of Protestant theology, and I was brought up into one side of it. But if you read this book, you see how much of that tendency also is in the history of Protestant theology, theology of the social gospel, and so on. It does the same thing. There's always that tendency to reduce Christ in particularity to a kind of universal principle of values and whatnot.
But see, I mean, that's one of the functions of the Mass. It keeps you Christologically centered and oriented. And within Protestant faith, for a very long time, our gospel and proclamation of the gospel kept us Christologically oriented. But now we live in a kind of cultural, social pressures that are requiring of us to accommodate, in order to keep people in our pews, or to get more people in our pews, to accommodate our message to a culture that doesn't like particularity with respect to Jesus Christ. And there are no liturgical, doctrinal, or other kinds of natural defenses that we have to shore up that Christological reference. And so we find ourselves slowly losing it. And there are still, of course, many centers within evangelicalism that would speak the same language of encounter with Christ. By the way, a little correction on the Pelagian thing. We Protestants only called you semi-Pelagian, which kind of made you only half a heretic.
I'd like to throw out a question here. I'm currently translating Father Giussani's biography that just came out this month in Italian. And in it, the question is asked in an interview with him later on in his life. Was it in the seminary that somebody pushed you, so to speak, toward American Protestant theology and toward Russian Orthodoxy? And he says no. He says, I came to a personal conviction that there was a very special moment in time when I was living. And it was a moment in time that saw the possibility of unity between the churches, a time that gave me the hope that there was a movement toward unity. And so I have a question for both of you, which is specifically regarding this work, but then regarding Giussani himself. And I know it's a very broad question, but to you, Mr. Spencer, from the point of view of a Protestant, and knowing the great difficulties, not only historical difficulties, but conceptual difficulties, we could say dogmatic difficulties, including questions about the stature of human nature and things like that. Do you think that Giussani has a contribution that can help us take a step in this direction? And is that even something valuable? And I would ask the same to you, as somebody coming from a Protestant background who made a step into the Catholic Church, and you said I had difficulty I'm perhaps exaggerating, but perhaps a convert is not the best ecumenical partner, ecumenical partner. What do you think as far as this book, and we as Catholics, and as we look on our Protestant brothers and sisters, and as Catholics, is there something that we can learn from this book and from Protestantism itself? So I'll use
Shall I lead? Okay, well, of course, my answer to the question is going to be absolutely. That's why I wrote the introduction. That's why I have been spending all of this time. By the way, on the side, I should say, my main work is mostly in Protestant theology. I teach in Protestant theology, I write in Protestant theology, but what extra time I do have, I invest in my research on Giussani, because Giussani has the stock and trade language that I think is going to, over time, appeal to Protestants. As a matter of fact, there have been whole shifts that have taken place. I'm sure that some of you are aware of this whole emerging church conversation that happened a little while back, and within neo-reformed wings of evangelicalism, there is now a desire to recapture aspects of the tradition that they feel have robbed them of a fuller expression of faith, which, by the way, includes symbols. And so there's a whole, we're in shifting times. And to my mind, Giussani is ideally placed to be a strong voice in that conversation. And I hope that he is. I think he has already the credentials for it by his rootedness in the Nouvelle Theologie, which had ecumenical concerns. But he also has the credentials for it in his doctoral work, he has the credentials for it in his work with his students that birthed the movement of CL. Because CL itself has been able to maintain its Catholic integrity and open its arms very wide. Why? Because of Giussani. And it's that kind of openness on both sides, we Protestants too, that's going to be needed to make steps towards one another. Giussani is essentially that process.
Well, as I mentioned the things that I thought that Giussani valued in Protestantism, and that they were invaluable for Catholicism, chief among which is this idea of experience, that John Edwards is really the father of, a healthy, robust idea of experience. Then to the primacy of grace. I say, speaking as I grew up at a certain time, and for real evangelicals, of the Orthodox Reformed stamp, we believed in Jesus, we wanted Jesus. I didn't have any real existential crises about whether he was true or not. I wish I had, it would have helped, but I didn't. But then the real existential crisis for me was, where is he? Where is he? Because you always have this sense that, and you sort of get this, especially when Giussani describes the liberal side of things in his book, you get the sense that Jesus risks being too much made after our measure. So there's the Jesus of the 1950s, the 60s, the 70s, and 80s, and he looks sort of suspiciously like each of those decades. And that's kind of a problem. And I remember very much as a young teenager, but then in college, was the burning question about the right church. So there was a lot of conversation about what's the right church. There was, which denomination, Reformed, EV free, this, that. And the other thing, the right church had to do with who's teaching the right thing about who Jesus is, right? And I even went down to Texas to a place where they were experimenting with coming together and living a kind of ecclesial life. And I thought there was a lot of promise in that. As you just said, a lot of us, we had this desire to live life together. And, but that blew up. Somebody had a pawn shop, someone got mad at him, and there was a complete breakdown of the whole thing because of this business dispute. And there was no one to whom to resort, there's no authority to resort to. So that really depressed me tremendously. And so, anyway, as you said, there's so many. I have brother-in-laws who are pastors of these churches. My brother is in an Anglo-Catholic church, and there are these constant conversations about, the church, the ecclesial dimension of things. And I have to say, it was really my intellectual sort of side of me. Was very much dominated by the question of what is the nature of the church. So the Puritans have this contractual idea, and in this discussion they began to change. I went to Giussani at one point, the only time I got to see him, and I said to him, I'm here now because I understood the nature of the church to be a covenant, not a contract, but a covenant, like a familial bond, something that constitutes you, not something that you create out of by contracting together. And he said, well, we exist, this movement exists, so that can be for you an experience. So there's a contribution in both directions.
Thank you. Bob.
I was very curious about the circumstances that created a man as universally open as Giussani in the formation process that took place in his life, I guess in Milan there. Did anybody form him, priests, clergy, ministers, rabbis, in that manner to create that kind of a universal man with such a great mind, soul, spirit, heart? Or are we just getting more and more specialized and learning more and more about less and less?
That's it.
Rhetorical question.
Yeah. Does Giussani's charism have to transcend Giussani in order to continue to have a life in the church? Here's a Protestant asking a Catholic that question. In my opinion, yes. And I think Giussani would want it to be so. He would not want us to be absolutely, absorbed with his particular life, but with the charism that his life came to express. So to the degree that understanding what shaped and formed the man would enable us to hold on to, and I mean, that us is not me, it's you, it would enable you, the church, to hold on to the sense of the charism that Giussani has become for you. Which I think, anything I've read about the history of charisms is they have their life in the church, and they do not last forever. And that's a fact of history. You can look at the history of that if you want. Some of these movements become, lay movements that have a particular place within the community of faith. Giussani's charism, in my estimation, is still very much an active principle. And so there ought to be ways that we can figure out how to maximize its impact over time. I don't know if that's answered your question or not, but that's my perspective from the evidence.
Oh, just the way he thinks about the relation between Christ and the world, both from the side of the world and from the side of Christ.
Margie.
Yeah, I mean, most of the people that are inspired by his charism, don't go into religion or theology. I mean, generally speaking, they're thrown into, all of the worldly pursuits, science, culture. Crossroads is an example, perhaps, looking at us right in the eye here, it exhibits really this this sense of how much Christianity becomes interested in all the worldly phenomena, politics, science, art, and so on.
Sir, right here in front.
Yes.
We'll get you the mic.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And you, sir, will be the last question.
In recent time, I've noticed that there's an interest in the question of the analogy of being. And I'm going to get the quotes a little bit wrong, but Karl Barth famously said when he was young, I think, that this could be the work of the Antichrist. And then later, I think he said something like, it's the only reason not to become a Roman Catholic. And I wonder, and so on the other side, there may be a dialectical sense of our relationship to God, which is different from the one of the analogy of the theme. And I wonder if this relates at all. Would Giussani have would his thought be inclined one way or the other here?
You have one,
I'm going to throw one other question, which is in one sentence. What is the dialogue about the analogy of being?
My goodness. It is a highly rarefied and conceptual principle that has been used in the history of the church to describe the way in which theological language functions. So it goes something like this. We have goodness, and because we don't know the absolute meaning of that goodness, but we know that it is good, there must be an absolute meaning for that goodness, which we then ascribe to God from the point of view of our own knowledge of our own goodness. So by analogy, we know that God is good. That's a very rough estimation of a very, very dense conceptual argument that I wouldn't even begin to try and unpack this evening. I did just finish writing a book that ended up being 650 pages on that very subject. So I could make your life absolutely miserable at this point, but I'm not going. Unfortunately, Karl Barth didn't say those two things in separate places. He said them in one and the same sentence. That the analogy of being, I regard the analogy of being to be the invention of the Antichrist, and that for that reason one cannot become a Catholic. Let me say it very simply. What he was saying in the phrase Antichrist was not against Christ and therefore against the church. He was saying that in the way in which the church talks about its theological language and grounds its dogmas, it uses analogy in a way that ends up replacing Christ with another Christ. And for that reason, he would have difficulty being a Catholic. But that discussion has since, he moved away from that position later on, slightly, and in a different direction. And I wouldn't use that phrase to characterize his overall relationship with Catholicism, because as Barth's theology develops, he becomes even closer and closer to the Catholic faith. And at the end of the day, one of his best friends is Hans Urs von Balthasar. Both of whom worked out together an understanding of analogy that, in my opinion, was somewhat amicable between the two. So that's, there's a lot there.
We will read your 600-page book. Sir.
You talked about Giussani as a follower of the New Theology School. Rusty Reno's talked about how the New Theologians, understanding them today, we lack a lot of their Thomistic formation that they were reacting against.
Yes.
And particularly because the Roman school was so interested in questions like predestination, with Garrett Lagrange and people like that, I'm wondering how that relates then to Giussani's interest in, since that was so interesting, that was an important part of his formation, those questions, because of the Thomist background. I'm wondering how that then related to his interest in Protestant theologians, especially of the Orthodox school, who are also very interested in those questions.
Perhaps Margaret can.
Margaret.
Can you just sort of sum up the question again?
So because the Roman Thomists were interested in questions like predestination, and then Giussani, it seems, had some sympathy with the Orthodox Protestant school that emerged in the United States, where they were also interested in those questions. I'm wondering if that background is important for understanding Giussani as well as his new theology background.
Well, there is a predestination theme here, and that is, I mean, the Garrigou-Lagrange revival of the doctrine of predestination along the Augustinian, Thomistic, Batesian terms today, I mean, is a position that the school of Venegono was directly trying to bring down. And I don't have any word about Giussani and predestination, let me just say that, but I'm assuming that he was in sync with them more or less. And unlike with Bach, unlike with Lubac and the French people who were debating nature, grace, kind of along abstract lines, the school of Venegono was trying to deal with it from the point of view of Christocentrism and the question of why the world. And so Lubac was very straightforward about that. He said, I received the debate, in the Thomistic terms, you start with nature, and then you talk about grace and so on. And but the school of Venegono was doing something actually a little bit even more interesting and posing the question of why the world and predestination. Well, there were a lot of people that were critical of the Augustinian doctrine of predestination from the point of view of whether or not it accorded with St. Paul and so on. But predestination for the school of Venegono was the answer to the question why the world, not why are some people saved and others not. So predestination was used to speak about the destiny or the meaning of the world itself. Why is the world created? So that the Son can be incarnate and become the firstborn among many brethren. That was very much at the heart of the school of Venegono. And so it's a very Christocentric reading of the world itself from the get-go. It's not the same thing as anonymous Christianity of Bronner. So it's very, very different.
Yeah. Yeah, oh yes, absolutely.
I'm going to interrupt you folks. I'm sorry. I must interrupt you. And first and foremost, I want to thank you for coming and speaking to us about Father Giussani and about his work on Protestant theology. Thank you for sharing your stories with us, your indulgence, your interest in it. So, a big